Hello, and welcome to the Biomedical Research Environment and Sponsored Programs Administration Development, or BRE-SPAD, Program Applicant Video Series. My name is Marie Harton, and I'm a Program Officer at the National Institute of General Medical Sciences at NIH. And today I will cover how the pilot research project funding works for the BRE-SPAD program. Before we get started, please note that this video series and accompanying slides or notes are for informational purposes only. They serve as an overview and are not meant to be comprehensive in coverage of all required components of an application. For any submission, applicants are responsible for following the instructions detailed in the SF424 guide, the Notice of Funding Opportunity or NOFO, and any related notices. In this video, I will provide a quick recap of the BRE-SPAD funding areas and funding considerations, and then I will provide an overview of the pilot research project funding area, how the process works, tips for applying and putting together the budget application, details on the participating NIH Institute and Center funding priorities, post-award expectations, and next steps. As a reminder, BRE-SPAD has three different funding areas. That is the Sponsored Programs Administration Development funding area to increase sponsored programs administration capabilities, such as staff, resources, training, etc. The research environment funding area to support activities to cultivate growth in research and research education activities, and the pilot research project program or PRP funding area, the subject of this video, which provides support for the development of a program to administer internal pilot research project funding to faculty conducting biomedical research with the goal of generating preliminary data to enhance the competitiveness of securing external research funding. And so for more information on the BRE-SPAD funding areas, please review Part 2, Sections 1 and 4 of the NOFO, but I also encourage you to watch the BRE-SPAD program overview video for more details as well. And I also want to remind you of the key BRE-SPAD funding considerations. And one important consideration for the BRE-SPAD program is that we want to support programs that have plans for ensuring faculty, staff, and students will have sufficient time to engage in the activities proposed in the application based on the organizational assessment. And another consideration is that BRE-SPAD is intended to build capacity at an organization that would not be possible without the BRE-SPAD fund. So it's not intended to just free up organizational funds. So with all that being said, applications with the following characteristics will be considered low priority for funding, even if other aspects review favorably. So if applicants fail to demonstrate that there will be sufficient faculty or staff time for research, mentoring of student researchers, grant writing, or student activities, or if applicants propose to fund ongoing activities that are already supported through organizational funds. And as a reminder, applications should propose plans in at least two of the funding areas. So if you are interested in the pilot research project program, please remember eligible organizations are expected to propose plans for at least one other funding area that can be the sponsored programs, administration development, or the research environment based on the needs identified in your organizational assessment. And of course, you're allowed to apply for all three funding areas if that is what your organization needs. And I also want to mention here that synergy and overlap across the three funding areas are allowed and encouraged if applicable. So now to provide a quick overview of the pilot research project funding area or the PRP funding area. It's intended to support the administration of a program that provides short-term funds for faculty to initiate biomedical research projects involving students to gather preliminary data to enhance the competitiveness for future grant applications. And so these pilot research projects must be for biomedical and biomedical related research supported by the missions of the NIH institutes and centers. So you'll have a copy of these slides, so I encourage you to take a look at this link that's included on this slide. And the pilot research projects may include human subject research, but they cannot involve clinical trials. And the principal investigators for the pilot research projects should be independent investigators or faculty and not trainees. This slide may be familiar to you from the BRE-SPAD program overview video, but in case you haven't seen it, I'll cover it briefly here, how the pilot research project funding works. So this funding area operates differently than the rest of the BRE-SPAD funding because in the BRE-SPAD application, you will only describe to reviewers how the overall pilot research project program will be created and managed. That is, you'll provide details on how it will be administered and the potential interest in such a program from faculty at your organization. And I'll cover more info on this in the next couple of slides. So if your BRE-SPAD application is funded, there will be a post-award process that allows your organization to submit specific pilot research projects for NIH review. So the most important part to remember from this slide here is that the BRE-SPAD application is not where you provide us with specific information on individual pilot projects. It's where you describe the rationale for creating the pilot research project program and how it will be managed. Now, let's get into some tips for applying to the PRP funding area. So first, please make sure to review and address all items included in Part 6C under Section 4 in the NOFO. These items will allow you to provide information on the need for the pilot research project program, who will benefit, and how it will be administered. For example, the process for solicitation, submission, review, and selection of the pilot research projects. Please remember that specific research projects should not be described. All of this information will be provided to NIH during the post-award process if your BRE-SPAD application is funded. It's also important to provide data on the current biomedical research faculty pool who are interested in applying to and would benefit from the proposed pilot research project program. So this will be helpful for viewers to assess the need for the proposed pilot project research program. I want to note here that we don't have any specific guidance or limitations on how this information is presented. It's just that you are required to include this information in your application. So you'll include information on the fields of study of these faculty. If the current faculty pool is low, which we understand, you can describe your plans to recruit additional biomedical faculty to participate in the pilot research project program. And applicants are also strongly encouraged to include letters of support from any interested faculty who would be potential candidates for the program. And so you can there's a little bit more information on this in the NOFO in the letters of support section, and it'll say potential pilot research project funding candidates. And so in these letters, the potential faculty candidates could describe their general research area and indicate how it is within the mission of NIH. Again, specific projects do not need to be described. Now, for the budget, applicants should determine their pilot research project program costs based on pilot project details like the expected number of projects, the duration, the funding level of these projects, and then any other administrative costs needed to run the program. And so we understand that this can really vary, from project to project, but please determine the possible range in funding that may be needed, based on your organizational assessment or other evaluations that you may have done, to to be able to ask for what you need in the application. The pilot research project program cost should be a line item within the SF424 R&R budget form under Section F of an other direct costs. And you can see what this looks like in the screenshot below on the slide. The accompanying justification, budget justification, is where you need to provide details on the pilot research project budget request. And so, a detailed budget breakdown is not expected because you aren't proposing specific projects at this point, but all general budget requests need to be justified and within the scope of the overall BRE-SPAD proposal. Now, you may have noticed there are multiple NIH institutes and centers, or ICs, that are listed as participating organizations at the beginning of the funding opportunity. For example, National Institute of General Medical Sciences, or National Eye Institute, or the National Institute on Aging, and the list goes on. So I want to stress here that BRE-SPAD programs are not required to have a research focus, as they may focus on developing biomedical research across the broad range of research areas within the NIH mission. However, some of the NIH ICs that are participating in this funding opportunity have expressed funding priorities based on the mission of their um, institute. So, if your organization is interested in developing a specific research area within the NIH mission, we encourage you to take a look at the funding priorities of the participating ICs listed on our website. But I want to remind you here that applicants are only required to focus on building research capacity in biomedical areas within the NIH mission. So please don't feel limited by the biomedical research areas and funding priorities of the participating NIH ICs. Now I want to go over some of the post-award expectations. So if your BRE-SPAD application is funded, you will be able to get your pilot research project program up and running, and following your internal organizational processes that are discussed in your competing application to review and select pilot projects for funding, organizations will be expected to submit documentation on each pilot project to NIH as part of the post-award process. And so the number of pilot projects submitted to NIH should generally align with the competing application in terms of, the number, expected number, duration, and funding level of the pilot projects. And, BRE-SPAD program staff will provide detailed guidelines for, the principal investigators on the required documentation that must be submitted to NIH to approve pilot projects. So I just want to um, uh, make sure you know that you'll get a lot of support from us here at NIH if you are, receive funding in the pilot research project program funding area. If you're looking for some general information on this, though, you can see section 6, part 2, that's titled Prior Approval of Pilot Projects. And here in this slide is just to remind you of the things to do before applying to BRE-SPAD, like determining your eligibility for the program or emailing a one-page summary to the BRE-SPAD email below for preliminary non-binding feedback of the proposed program fit from a BRE-SPAD program officer. So all of this information is up on the BRE-SPAD webpage, and it's also covered in a lot more detail during the BRE-SPAD program overview. So if you haven't watched that video, I encourage you to do so. So I'm not going to cover it here, but if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to reach out to the BRE-SPAD email, which is nigms.brespad@nigms.nih.gov to get in touch with one of us BRE-SPAD program officers directly. So, as mentioned previously, we encourage all applicants to email a one-page summary to the BRE-SPAD program staff using the email address, BRE-SPAD email address. And this will just allow BRE-SPAD program officers to provide preliminary non-binding feedback on the proposed program's fit. So if there's any aspects that you describe about your program within that one-page summary that may not be responsive to the BRE-SPAD funding opportunity, we will let you know. We won't provide details on how to design your program because that is something that you know best, based on your organizational context and needs, but we can help you to determine if your program is on the right track. Program application is on the right track as far as being within the scope of the BRE-SPAD program goals and funding considerations. So in your one-page summary, we ask you to provide the information listed here to provide enough background information to help us determine the responsiveness of your proposed application to the funding opportunity announcement. This is all up on our webpage, but if you have questions, please feel free to reach out to the BRE-SPAD email, general email. So thanks so much for tuning in to this BRE-SPAD applicant video on the pilot research project funding program funding area. I encourage you to watch the other videos in the series presented by Dr. Sadella Blatch that cover the program overview and also the overview of the application information. Again, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to the BRE-SPAD email at the bottom of this slide. And thanks again for your interest in BRE-SPAD and for tuning in today, and have a great day.